one of the most traditional Italian, specifically Italian American dishes of braised bitter greens and beans that I know of. This is escarole and beans, or maybe it's beans and escarole. This is a super traditional dish, but it's Italian American. It resembles a lot of dishes from Italy, but this one is specifically Italian American. At least that's how I know it. I was introduced to this by Chef Lenny Russo when I worked with him at Heartland restaurant in St. Paul. You can see this recipe is adapted from the one in his book. And besides his book, which I was the food stylist for many years ago, he also gave it to one of the food editors at the Washington Post, and you can see it's on the cover of Joe Yonen's book there, but he has substituted rapini for the escarole. And one of the quote that sticks in my mind, I actually called Lenny so I could get the quote again. He was in New York over the holidays, and what he'd say is, we didn't have a lot of money growing up, so we ate a lot of escarole and beans. Sometimes we'd switch it up. Then we had beans and escarole, and you can tell a lot about the dish just from that quote. This is a dish from the cucina povera. This is poverty cuisine. This is, a nutritious dish of beans and greens. It's got all 7 amino acids that your body needs, and it's cheap, comes together quickly. But if you haven't cooked with escarole, it basically looks like leaf lettuce, and it tastes like a bitter chicory. And it can be a little bit tricky to find, but there are some substitutes. So just like you saw on the cover of Joe's book, rapini or broccoli rabe, this is probably my favorite substitute. It's going to be a little bit more bitter, and they take longer to cook. Dandelion greens are another great substitute. These are cultivated dandelion greens. Wild dandelion greens have a higher proportion of stem, and they're going to take longer to cook. Mustard greens are probably the most common and widely available substitute. They're an okay substitute. But I would prefer rapini or dandelion greens over them. Okay, for the beans, you can use canned beans, but it is not as good as making your own. And if you want to do it, I really suggest you make your own. You're going to get a better flavor, and it just gives you a little bit more control over things. So we just soak the beans in water overnight, and one of the cool things you get to try is if you have not ever made a clove-studded onion, this is one of the most perfect places to use one. It's kind of a classic seasoning for dishes with beans. You just take like 10 dried cloves, stick them into a peeled onion. Then we're going to drain the beans, add our clove-studded onion, a couple peeled carrots, a couple dried bay leaves, and then we're going to cover it with fresh water. And then I am also going to add a good pinch of salt. And then we just cook the beans until they're nice and tender. Take the aromatics out, and we will just discard those and thank them for their service. And then we're going to drain the bean liquid off. If you want to add like a little bit, that's okay, but you can see it's pretty dark, and we want to keep the dish nice and light. And the beans have soaked up plenty of flavor there. Okay, now putting together the dish. So the escarole, basically it looks like green leaf lettuce, and it tastes like bitter chicory greens. It's so good. It cooks up really fast. It gets nice and tender. We're just going to take the greens off, and we're going to kind of cut them into dice. I'm going to trim that little piece of stem off, and then we're just going to cut these into basically like 1-inch dice, because that's going to fit on a spoon. And I don't like things like greens that are long hanging off a spoon. So we want them to be in, really manageable sized pieces there. Then I'm going to cook some sausage. This is optional. You could also use lump sausage, but I just cooked a few links there and baked them. Then we start the pan off with a little bit of garlic in the sausage drippings. And then we're going to add the escarole, which I have washed in water and drained. Then we add the escarole and cook it. Meanwhile, we can take the sausage, and again, we want things to fit onto a spoon, so I cut them in half, and then I'm going to cut them into half moons. If your sausages are thinner, you can just cut them into rings, or you can, use lump sausage. Now you can see there's a lot of steam going on here, so I have a fan blowing because it'll fog up my camera lens. We're just going to cook the escarole until, it's all wilted. Then we're going to add the beans. and some homemade chicken stock. And like a lot of Italian dishes, this is kind of like a stew. It's not wet enough to be a soup. It's really just stewed beans and greens, and then we can add some sausage if we want. And it's a really fulfilling dish. It's so good that the juice, the pan juices here just get so rich and delicious. And this fed me for an entire week for a couple bucks. But you can see it's not exactly a stew, not exactly a soup, but you can make this into a soup if you add, 4 extra cups of chicken stock and a little carrot, onion, and celery all diced up. Lots of different ways you can vary this. But you can see there, I just wanted to kind of show you the consistency. And garnish it with Parmesan cheese or Pecorino Romano when it's done, when you serve it. It'll get better over time. And it is such a good, nutritious, cheap dish to learn how to make that you can use lots of different bitter greens. Great way to use bitter greens and beans to make a filling, cheap meal. The full recipe is on my website. There's a link at the top of the video description for that. Thanks for watching.